How hot is it going to feel today? Is it going to rain? Should I carry a jacket?
Plenty of sunshine.
The weather report can give us a sense, but does it tell us the whole story? Our daily thermal experience is actually quite complex. Why does the same day feel pleasant in one part of the city and unbearable in another? What determines this variation? How are the urban environment and our thermal sensation related? Our bodies adapt to maintain a core temperature of around 98 degrees. We are responding to air temperature, air humidity, air speed, sunlight, and the temperature of the objects around us. By understanding these factors spatially, we can estimate how a certain place is going to feel and change the perception of its temperature. Two public spaces in Midtown Manhattan at lunchtime in June: Bryant Park and Times Square. Each has an average air temperature of 75 degrees that feels more like 77 given elevated summer humidity. But Times Square is also denser and unvegetated. Here, we can expect to feel an additional 2 degrees. The best way to escape humidity is a good breeze. In the winter, wind in Manhattan makes us feel as much as 15 degrees colder. On this June day, it comes as a relief. The open, more exposed areas of Bryant Park benefit from faster air. Thermal sensation is reduced by almost 2 degrees. Of all factors, sunlight is often most influential. On its own, direct solar radiation can increase perceived temperatures by more than 25 degrees. Even in the shade, sunlight reflected off buildings in the ground will make us feel warmer and heat up those surfaces, radiating additional heat back to us. The lack of shading in Times Square, combined with asphalt temperatures up to 100 degrees, will add up to an additional 10 degrees of thermal sensation. The results are in. On the same day, at the same time in June, the perceived temperature of Times Square is 13 degrees higher than Bryant Park. Of course, shade is not always better than sun. Each of the factors we've considered changes dynamically through the year. In July, protecting from direct sunlight is the difference between comfort and stress for over 70% of hours. But in March, sunlight is desirable. And in January, sunlight doesn't really make a difference the way, say, wind does. Let's look at Bryant Park over every hour of the year. The color green indicates the zones where thermal comfort is more abundant. During summer months, the areas under the tree canopy and within the narrow shadow around the library will stay comfortable for over 80% of sunlight hours. For people on their lunch break, these are the most popular destinations. In contrast, the buildings around the park make for continued solar exposure on 42nd Street, which will feel too hot for more than half the summer. Street trees could make a world of difference here. These big contrasts largely disappear during the winter months, where the low air temperature and wind drive the thermal equation. Comfort is limited to 15% of the time for most of the park. However, we can still identify a pocket in the northwest corner where the combined exposure to sunlight in morning and afternoon doubles the number of comfortable hours. At Times Square, most areas are surprisingly comfortable for about 2/3 of the summer, thanks to the shading of tall buildings. But higher surface temperatures and low winds prevent what could mean further cool down. On the north side of the surrounding streets, direct sunlight penetrates more often. The problem of heat stress is exacerbated for over half the summer. In the winter, low sun angles rarely penetrate the square. Too cold and too shaded for over 80% of hours, Times Square faces the same problems of many other narrow public spaces in Midtown that are not thermally comfortable. In our investigation of urban microclimates in New York, we must consider the future. The number of hours over 95 degrees will grow over 5% by 2050 and 10% by 2080, increasing the chance of overheating and making solar design even more relevant. In urban design, we can quantify each thermal sensation factor using climate data and wind and solar modeling. These tools allow us to assess the impact of new developments on existing public spaces and the communities they serve. They also help us identify and map locations at risk and inform the formulation of new performance zoning requirements. It is the duty of designers, planners, and community leaders to understand the factors that influence thermal sensation in order to create sustainable, healthy, and just spaces, now and in the future. Good night, air. Good night, wind. Good night, sun.
And now, for some further remarks on thermal comfort, please welcome Carlos Cerezo Davila, Environmental Design Director at KPF.
This is going to be it's going to be a very short remark, but thank you so much, MAS, for having us contribute a little bit to this day-long discussion, which I think it's an extremely important and exciting one, because it's trying to add some nuance to how light is understood and sunlight is understood in New York. And I think what this video is trying to very briefly and in a cute manner introduce and hopefully open a discussion is about how nuanced that relationship is and how we should understand, everybody in this room, first, that this is not only a question about light and shadow, it's a question about all of the other things that have to do with sunlight, some of them expressed in this video, that define how we experience the city and also how at risk we might find ourselves in the future if we don't think about them carefully, but also to highlight the fact that these are not obscure metrics, these are not obscure things that we don't understand. We can measure, we can model, we can quantify the effect of sunlight on thermal sensation, the effect of sunlight on what happens to vegetation, to public spaces, and that we have to take that into account when we think about advocacy and policy to make sure that we move on from this obsolete zoning approach of the relationship between buildings and materials and sunlight into something more nuanced and more scientific. I hope that this has been somewhat a inspirational or educational contribution, and that after this, now you're going to hear a much more detailed account of some of these factors from our next speaker, but that this start, as I said, a more nuanced and more metric-based conversation around sunlight. Thanks.